You're listening to Boomers Today with your host, Frank Sampson.
Welcome, everyone, to Boomers Today. I'm Cynthia Perthews, and today I'm filling in for Frank Sampson. I'm so thrilled to have Peggy Sarlin as my guest. Peggy has recently updated and released the third edition of her book, Awakening From Alzheimer's. She lives in New York, where besides writing books, she's also a health coach and a singer-songwriter. We'll have her on later to talk about the singer-songwriting. Today, we're going to talk about Alzheimer's. And we're going to talk to Peggy in about 30 seconds after we hear about our sponsor. Today's sponsor is Senior Care Authority, a national elder care consulting company specializing in senior living. With over 75 locations around the country, Senior Care Authority's team of certified senior advisors work in person with older adults and their families to find the best care and living options. If you have questions or need help navigating the maze of senior care and living options, reach out to Senior Care Authority for a free consultation. You can go to www.seniorcareauthority.com to find a local representative and get the help you need. So, Peggy, welcome. How are you?
I'm very excited to be here, Cynthia, with you and to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world, which is brain health and how to prevent and reverse cognitive decline and all the wonderful things you can do to keep yourself and your loved ones in good cognitive shape.
Well, this is one of my favorite topics because I come from a world of Alzheimer's in my family and know that it's kind of lurking in my own genes. And I love the discussion about the health and the things that we can do. So we're going to talk about your book for a few minutes, and then we also may intertwine with that about a video series that you recently released. I know that you investigate these alternative remedies. So tell me, how did you get there and why did you get there?
Well, it's interesting. I have never dealt with Alzheimer's or dementia personally, at least when I started writing this. But I would like to start out by saying that's changed because some time has gone by. My parents are now in their 90s. And last week, they moved into assisted living and they have very noticeable cognitive decline. So for the first time, I'm actually living this, not writing about other people's experiences. And the way that it started was that my publisher, I'm a writer, and I write about health. I write about all kinds of things. And my publisher called me up and said, my mother just passed from Alzheimer's and the doctors couldn't do anything for her. Could you look into this and see if there's anything to be done? So I started researching it and became apparent to me very quickly. I felt like Columbus discovering the New World. This was back in 2011 when I started this. There was already so much that was known about what causes cognitive decline and how to reverse it. And some of these things were really very simple. I mean, to give an example, dehydration. That's, very, very common factor amongst older people is they're just not aware. They're not thinking about drinking enough. You get them hydrated, their mind works better. Well, there's so many factors like this that are contributing and nobody had put it together. So I wrote a book, Awakening from Alzheimer's. What I'm showing you here is actually the third edition. I've since updated it twice because since this book was published, there's been enormous developments in this field. It's taking off like crazy and it's extremely exciting.
I do a lot of speaking around what I call healthy brain and body. And that what's good for your brain is what's good for your body and for your heart is good for your brain. And I think that's kind of where you're coming along. You talk about dehydration. There's other ways to get liquids besides just drinking a big glass of water. And I know one of the things that we discuss at times within my own group is, do people like ice or not ice? Do they want some fruit floating around in it? We see what are called hydration stations in some of these communities now. But also even just having a sugar-free popsicle. There's so many different ways to get hydrated.
That's a really good point. And you mentioned a hydration station at one of these places. I wanted to discuss, because now I'm coming at this from a different point of view, which is, a loving daughter who's in this situation, making decisions on behalf of her parents. And so I thought we could talk about some risk factors for brain health, things that could be reversed. And if you're deciding, is this right for my husband? Is this right for my mother? To move them into a facility when they're living independently, that this might help you make that decision. Let's look at some of the risk factors and see how they might be positively impacted by putting them in an appropriate facility.
Sure. And one of the things I do want to make sure that I come to you from my own background as well is a couple of things you said there. Well, one thing I'm gonna pick on is that they're living independently and then you want to move them someplace. And I think that what you may have found, maybe putting words into your mouth, what you may have found is that you thought your parents were living physically independently, but maybe they really weren't as independent as we all thought they were, or as you thought they were. We find that a lot, that people think that because they're theoretically eating a meal and keeping the house up to a certain extent and bathing, that they must be living independently. But we find out a lot of times that once we pull the covers off, there's not any independence in that household at all. Did you see that on your side?
Yes, they were dependent on my brother completely. They were no longer able to drive, but they had no understanding that they were depending on it. So when my brother said, this isn't viable anymore, I can't be coming here every day, all day, to take you to the podiatrist, to clean out your fridge from spoiled food, etc. They said, what are you doing? What do you mean? You're not doing anything for us. They lacked the awareness. And so this is part of the complexity of making these decisions.
Right.
And as I say, now I'm living it, so it's different than just
right.
It's living it.
So I know we talked about hydration. What are some other things that are some natural alternative ways to help people take care of their cognition?
Well, I'd like to talk about some of the mental health, social health issues. We've just come through this horrific period of lockdowns. And in my opinion, and this is my opinion, I'm giving you my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, this was not the way to go. Because from everything I have learned about brain health, locking people off and trying to seal them in a hermetic bubble was not going to improve their health. Health is many, many things, including, and I'd like to go over the list of what some of those things are. And I think many people of all ages, even kids, are in less good shape mentally and cognitively than before we began this great lockdown experiment. And that I've seen that with my parents as well. And so I'd like to talk about loneliness, if I may. There was a report that came out actually this week from the U.S. Surgeon General, titled "Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation." And this was even before the COVID pandemic. Half of U.S. adults reported experiencing loneliness. And the physical consequences of loneliness can be devastating. 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, 50% increased risk of dementia for older adults. And people have been locked away and kept away from family, friends, churches, and their health is suffering. Putting them in a facility, which is a carefully chosen, high quality, appropriate facility, will immediately have them interacting with other people.
Correct.
That is immediately a bonus, in my opinion.
No, and I think you're right. I was doing work around some of this isolation piece pre-COVID, because in the job that I have, the work that I do, I would have these, let's say you had a spouse, you had the husband died, your father died, and the wife, the mother was left behind in that situation. And families would say to me, there's no reason to move her to a community anytime soon. She loves to putter around the house. It was the word I heard all the time. She loves to putter around the house. And what I found out really pre-COVID, but especially into COVID, was that all of us, if we had been told, oh, you're going to have to be away from, there's no fear of missing out, you're going to have to be away for a while, you'll get to be in your home, you get to watch TV, you'll get to putter around your house, we would have said, oh man, that sounds like a really great vacation for a couple of weeks. But then we know it turned into months and months. But what the elderly and the older adult who was at home puttering, we were finding out they were forgetting what day it was, they were forgetting to eat, they were getting depressed, they were lonely.
Yes.
This was pre-COVID. This was happening.
Yes. Yes.
So, we know there's a saying out there that being isolated, socially isolated, is as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Correct.
Nobody does that anymore, but we know how bad it is for health.
Well, loneliness is linked to two other conditions, which are not limited to older people these days. I mean, the American mental health crisis is extreme.
Right.
But one of those problems that we can link loneliness to is depression. And depression has a very distinct effect on the brain. It decreases activity in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is where Alzheimer's starts. Hippocampus is the home of short-term memory. Similarly, loneliness could be linked to anxiety, which stimulates cortisol, and cortisol is physically destructive of the brain, and particularly of the hippocampus. We're back to the hippocampus. It eats away at it. It shrinks the size of it. This is the memory center. So getting your loved one into a place where there's movement, there's activity, there's other people, there's something new. That brings me to another one. What do we need for good brain health? We don't need to be in Groundhog Day, where every day is exactly the same, which was what lockdown was. It's incredibly corrosive to the brain. And what you're puttering around, which sounds like it might be okay, is actually not so okay, because it's the same kind of puttering all day. You need to be in a place where, oh, today we have oh, Mrs. Jones, please come down to the activity room. We have a beautiful concert today, and you're going to love this singer. We have a book club discussion. We're going to have a movement class. You need, and a different person comes. It's a staff. The shift changes. You're talking to another person. You need novelty. You need brain stimulation at any age, and you need it when you're older. When you're older and isolated, less physically active, it's harder to get that novelty, that stimulation. And that's why moving into a high quality, appropriate facility may be a good idea.
Well, and I agree with you, of course, 100%. I agree on this. I can tell you an example. I have a client that, and I hear this from the adult children a lot. Well, she's not very social. He's not social. He's not going to want to lead the bridge game. He doesn't like bingo. He doesn't like concerts, all these beautiful things that happen. And this client of mine, when I would go to the community where she had moved, and she was one of those, oh, she's not social. But she would always be sitting by the door with a newspaper in her lap, in her wheelchair by the door. And she wasn't really speaking to people, but she was getting human interaction. And in my mind and in my soul, because I knew her, I knew that she was sitting there thinking, how could that person be wearing those shoes? Why in the world did they think that outfit looked well? They need to go have their hair done. Whatever, she was getting human interaction, no matter what her brain was thinking on the inside. And she was not, joining in the reindeer games, if you will, but she was seeing people all day, every day, and it kept her brain active.
Well, that's the exact same dynamic as why you go to Starbucks with your laptop. So you're not going to be, it's a different feeling if you're home alone, working remotely at your desk, or if you're out there and there's people around, there's sounds, there's visual stimulation, and you're just aware that there's humanity, even if you're not interacting. And so so I agree with you. Maybe she's not a social person, but she was getting social stimulation on the level that she liked and was comfortable with, and it was positive.
Correct. We also know that dementia and depression sometimes look alike. And so you need to go
Yes.
get checked and see what's going on, because it would be really sad if all you had was depression and there were some things that could be treated for that. When everyone was thinking that you had dementia, and they were treating you like someone who had dementia when it was really depression. And there's treatments that are different for each dementia and depression.
Can I jump in there? A big risk factor for depression and a big risk factor for dementia is not having sufficient omega-3 oils. And so you asked, when we were talking before about dehydration, getting possibly taking supplements. I take supplements, lots of people do, eating diet that's heavy, that includes the smash fish, which is sardines, mackerels, anchovies, salmon, and herring. And, olive oil, avocado oil. Getting these healthy oils is very appropriate for both depression and dementia.
Yes, yes, I agree with you. That is excellent information. Tell me about some other things. I know some of the things we talk, again, back to dehydration a little bit, UTIs are very common. And those
UTIs, I'm glad you mentioned that. I wrote that down because when you get older, it's common to have UTI, which is urinary tract infections. If you're not familiar with the acronym, with this beautiful acronym here, UTIs are very common when you get older, and older people actually may not be as acutely aware of it because their nerve endings are duller, and so they may actually be suffering from it. And actually, this is a very good tip to have here. So I wrote it down to bring it up. I'm glad you beat me to it. If dementia is a slow moving decline. It declines actually over decades. If you were to take a scan of somebody in their 30s or 40s, you might see the beginnings of it. If somebody goes off a cliff, it's not dementia. Something else is happening, and I can give you two possible explanations that might be useful. One of them is a UTI, and that can manifest as really hallucinations. I mean, that can get extremely severe. And so that, and if you're in a facility, that is going to be tracked and noticed and tested for on a much simpler basis than if you're home all alone puttering. Who's going to know?
Right.
Because you may not know. So that's one thing I want to say. If you see a precipitous decline, possibility is UTI. Another unfortunate possibility is a toxic exposure. A toxic exposure can look like that. And that can be something, again, unfortunately, like mold. Dr. Dale Bredesen, who is the leading pioneer in this field of reversing Alzheimer's, found to his great surprise that when he was working and testing Alzheimer's patients, the majority of them had mold exposure. This was not something he was expecting. And so if your loved one is there puttering around in a moldy environment, suddenly goes downhill, has there been a leak in the bathroom? I mean, again, who's going to know? So these are important things to keep in mind. A cognitive decline in a kind of natural way is gradual.
Right.
Something sudden, look for another cause.
Right. Right. Exactly. No, I agree with you. Now I know that you also have done a video series, and it's very similar to what your book is, but talk to me about what are the things in the video series, because you've done that recently. What are some things that you found, and what are some things that you're still pondering about working on for your next project?
Well, I have done actually 3 video series. This was turned into a video series. And then I did Regain Your Brain, which was also a book. And then I just did a new video series, which was shown online, signing up via Facebook and other online portals, and is going to be shown again in the fall. It's called Brain Health Breakthroughs. And there's also a podcast you can listen to called Brain Health Breakthroughs with lots of good information. One of the people that I interviewed for the podcast is Drew Ramsey, who's a nutritional psychiatrist, who actually discusses the very best foods to eat to prevent depression and anxiety. Number one, care to guess the number one food he suggests for?
I would always say it's fish, but I have to think it's something different than fish.
Oysters. So you're
Oysters. Okay, it's
there
it's in
that. There you go. There is
look, I could eat my weight. I could eat my weight in oysters, and in fact, in New York, but pre-COVID, it used to be $1 oyster night, but then it went up to $1.25 and $1.30. But I could just go eat my weight, and so now that helps me, give me another reason to eat as many oysters
to eat. Yeah, that's right. You see, that's why you're so sharp. You see, one of the people I interviewed was Dr. Daniel Stickler, who is a big believer in peptides, and that's one of the stories of this time. There are peptides you can take, which he has found to be extremely effective for reducing some of these symptoms like depression and anxiety, but also that contributed to cognitive decline, but also cognitive decline itself, not necessarily linked to those. So that is an emerging field.
Can you help me understand what's a peptide? You're saying PEP?
Peptide, PEPTIDE, and I first noticed them when I would go, to the beauty counter and see, oh, here are peptide serums that you can put on your eyelids and they'll regrow your eyelashes. This whole multi-million-dollar field that's emerging. But there are specific peptides that target cognitive health. And so I believe one of them was cerebrosilin, if I remember. Okay, something like that. I can't remember it offhand. But there continue to be many new developments. In the podcast, I interviewed, and you can go to any podcast carrier and listen to all of these interviews. Dr. Philip Blair, former combat physician, is now totally focusing his practice on CBD, which he finds tremendously helpful for easing symptoms of dementia, such as calming people down, he finds it enormously helpful for all kinds of contributing factors to Alzheimer's. So there's lots of new experience, new resources and ideas and developments in this space of brain health, which is one of the most active spaces in medicine today.
Right. No, it's exciting. And it's exciting that some of these things are not, that they're easy. They're really easy. There are things you can find in your grocery store. There are things that you can find in your health food store. There are things that we can just do without going to a store. A lot of the items that I know you've talked about and that I believe in too are not brain science. It's things that are just really simple.
Well, one of those I kind of in this book, first edition, one of the things I talked about was coconut oil and the importance of ketones, and that continues to be developed more and more and more and more evidence. Dr. Heather Sanderson is a leader in the field of Alzheimer's, and for people who are interested in the facility, she developed the very first residence designed to be temporary, designed for people with Alzheimer's to come and stay for 6 months or maybe a year, and then go back and live independently. Because what she's done, I mentioned Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's the leader. She's created a perfect Bredesen environment for people to go into. As an example, maybe you don't know your home has mold. Her residence, which is called Marama, Marama, in the San Diego area of California, is relentlessly checked for mold. That's an example. And she says she will not work with people who are not willing to try a ketogenic diet, because that's so important. And just for people who need a little primer in that, a ketogenic diet encourages the production of ketones, and ketones are brain fuel that can penetrate the brain, the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier tends to be damaged in people with cognitive decline, but and therefore the barrier has trouble accepting insulin inside it, and insulin and bringing glucose is the brain fuel. So you're not getting enough fuel. Your brain gets starved. It starts to die because of starvation. Right. With ketones, ketones get right in there, boom, like a champ. They're just right in there doing their thing, fueling things right up. So Dr. Mary Newport, whose story I tell here in this book, gave coconut oil to her husband, Steve, who had early onset Alzheimer's. And he said it was like a light switch that came on, because he suddenly came alive. And so this is something that I'll never say there's a consensus, because doctors like to argue, but amongst the doctors I interview, I would say there is a general consensus that promoting ketosis, at least intermittently, not every day, but maybe 4 days a week, 5 days a week, is one of the absolute best things you can do for your brain.
Right. Okay. So you know what? I could do like 4 or 5 podcasts with you. So I've taken down some of these topics we've talked about. We need to get back together again. Where we're running out of time. So what I want to make sure is, where can our audience find you? How do they find you and find your materials?
I would say the best thing is write to me. I'm also a health coach. If you want to work with me, I particularly like to focus on brain health. Obviously, that's my deep passion, which I share with Cynthia. So you can find me. It's easy. It's my name, Peggy at PeggySarlin.com. Sarlin, like darlin, Sarlin. Peggy at PeggySarlin.com.
Great. Thank you again, Peggy. And we'll go into our close now that we know how to find you.
Okay, perfect. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Peggy, and our audience for joining us. These podcasts always have new nuggets for helpful information. So again, this is Cynthia Perthuse for Boomers Today, and join us next time as we navigate issues that affect.
You've been listening to Boomers Today with Frank Sampson. To learn more about today's show, visit boomerstodayradio.com and join us next time for another edition of Boomers Today.